The good news of our salvation in Jesus is that Christ died for the ungodly. That's what Paul tells us in Romans 5, verse 6. We're the ungodly. Christ died to redeem us. And because of that, Jesus wants to use you for the Father's glory. He wants to take your life and have you minister however he chooses to enable you to do it for the Father's glory. Now, he can do that in very unusual ways. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we do something else, but our lives speak of Jesus Christ. Arthur Stace was born to a family of alcoholics in Sydney many years ago, and as a child he had to just scavenge for food to survive, to make ends meet. At the age of 7 he was placed into foster care. At the age of 14 he actually started to work in a coal mine, New South Wales South Coast, and at the age of 15 he was actually imprisoned in Sydney, put into jail for theft and other trouble that he was causing around the streets of Sydney. In the year 1916, during the First World War, Arthur enlisted and he was sent over to France to be in the front lines. He was a stretcher bearer, and so he saw some horrendous sights, had some incredible stories to tell, if you want, about all of that. He tragically, he was gassed and half blinded in one eye during that time, so he was discharged, sent back to Sydney. Unlike so many who returned from the war, they didn't know what to do with themselves. He really didn't have any family connections or anything. So Arthur was destitute on the street. Here was this young man who had served his country. He's now sitting on the street destitute, begging for money, and eventually just drinking bottles of methylated spirits to put the day in and so on. He was a drunkard, a down and out, and all of that. Then on August 6, 1930, Arthur heard the preaching of Reverend Hammond at St. Barnabas Street Church in Broadway in Sydney. And he went in there just to simply get some food, like the other guys who were homeless and so on. He would go in there, get some food. He says, I went in to get a cup of tea and a rock cake, but I met the Rock of Ages. And Arthur's life was transformed. Arthur's life was forever changed. He never be the same again after that moment. He now began to have his life all tidied up. He began to try and find work, began to get on his feet a little bit, began to think differently, act differently, function differently, didn't touch the alcohol anymore. All because Jesus Christ was now his Redeemer. 2 years after that conversion experience, Arthur heard the preaching of a great Australian evangelist who you've heard of. His name is John Ridley. John Ridley had served in the same front line as Arthur, and here he is preaching and declaring Jesus Christ. And here's Arthur sitting there, this young man who's just given his life to Christ 2 years earlier, and he's hearing Ridley preach this amazing message where Ridley screams out, eternity, eternity. I wish I could sound out or shout that word to everyone in the streets of Sydney. Eternity, you have to meet it. Where will you spend eternity? And Arthur Stace was just so taken by that word eternity, by that statement, that he couldn't do a whole lot with it, but he had a piece of chalk in his pocket. And after the service, he went out the front of the church, and in beautiful script, he wrote the word eternity. You've seen it, you're familiar with it. And Arthur then went about Sydney, went about Australia, writing that word wherever he could. And it's recorded that he wrote that word more than 500,000 times, just the word eternity. And people began to pay attention to that. Some people began to see Christ because of that. Some were saved through that and then being led to Christ by somebody else. But here was Arthur, this man who couldn't do a whole lot. He wasn't going to be a preacher like Ridley, but he could write that amazing word, eternity. And so on New Year's Day in the year 2000, as we entered this new millennium, the world looked on to see the Sydney Harbour Bridge light up with fireworks, but most importantly, to see that amazing word, eternity, written in the script of Arthur Stace. Here's this man who wasn't educated, wasn't literate really, could only write a few words, didn't have great diction or speech, but that word eternity was the word that stole his heart. And that word eternity was the word that he proclaimed out there. I don't know how God's going to use you. I don't know what God will want you to do, but I do know our fellow Australians are going to stand in eternity. They're going to meet eternity. Where will they spend eternity? It's time we tell them God's truth. So maybe you're the next Arthur Stace. Maybe you're the one that says, I want you to do this. I want you to declare my name this way. Whatever it is, make sure you do it because his glory depends on it. And it's all for the benefit of seeing souls come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Be blessed as you take up the challenge. Be blessed as you step into God's plan for your life, whatever that might be. Thanks for listening.